Here you can see my composition laid out on Arches watercolor paper. This is 300-pound paper and I'm painting on a half sheet today. I've gridded it off with my composition. This is a small selection of my brush collection. I like to have all kinds of flats in different sizes and points also. Mostly I use synthetic brushes. Here I'm using a 5-inch Hake wash brush to wet only the sky, and I'm painting around the tops of the hills so that they remain dry because I don't want my sky wash to get down in there. This is my first color string made from horizon blue and cerulean blue, and I've got lots of thick, very milky paint there. It has very little water in it, and I have a big supply because this is a big sheet of paper and I don't want to have to stop partway through my wash and mix up new paint. I'm using my size 20 Richardson pointed round here, which is one of my favorite brushes. I've used these brushes for over 20 years, and Richardson perfected this synthetic blend that makes these brushes behave very similarly to the more expensive sables. They hold a lot of paint and they can make very fine pointed lines with the tip. Nice spring and bounce in that brush. I keep that thing dancing across the sheet. You can see the sheet still very damp, so that as I put colors on it they immediately spread out. And this is what I want. So I'm using a combination of cool and warm grays in the sky right over the top of that horizon blue and cerulean blue initial wash. And as I bring this wash down to the tops of the hills, I'm careful not to paint over the tops of those hills, so I keep my margins nice and clean there. You can see how wet this sheet is by how quickly these washes just run downhill. I've got my board tilted up at an angle to help me control the direction that these washes are going to run. Painting this way is more of a dance than it is a drawing exercise, and I think that's what I like about it. You've really got to move quickly and be decisive. You've got to have colors mixed up in advance in your palette, and you've got to carefully control the amount of water in your brush, keeping in mind that there's already water on the paper anyway. You can see in the sky there's some speckling caused by using a spray bottle of clear water. These spray bottles can be very handy for creating texture, but sometimes it's a mistake, as it is here in the sky. But I'm going to use this as an exercise to show you how you can repair that. Most people think you can't repair watercolors or go backwards, but you can fix some things. Here I'm using a kneaded eraser to erase those guidelines on my sheet. This is my color string for the hills, and it's made from burnt umber, yellow ochre, and Indian yellow, that very intense yellow. Indian yellow is a Holbein color. That's my 3-inch very soft flat I'm using to draw the clear water across the top of the hills and all the way down. And now I'm using a 1-inch Richardson flat. This is another one of my favorite brushes that Richardson makes. These beautiful synthetics can be used to, especially this flat, can be used to lay out big flat strokes like I'm doing here, or use the edge to draw sharp lines with, almost razor sharp. So it's a very versatile brush. I'm trying to build the deep tones that are in the hills and the bottom portion of this painting. So I'm laying in some burnt siennas, burnt umbers, a little bit of Windsor violet, and some yellow ochre in there. You see how wet this is? It's practically running off the sheet. So I lay in really thick paint. There's barely any water in it, just enough to make it flow, and that's a big juicy wash of burnt sienna and burnt umber there. Here I'm using the edge of that nice 1-inch flat. See how you can draw those nice lines with it and then turn it sideways and make it do a wash effect? It's a beautiful brush. Establishing the tops of the hills with that size 20 pointed round. I'm careful on this damp sheet, as I will be throughout this entire painting, not to spend too much time with the point of my brush in one or the other damp or wet area, because all the paint in that brush will unload immediately if you tarry too long. So you've got to keep that brush moving, and you can control that effect. But if you dilly-dally and you aren't decisive with your strokes, you'll just get a big blob of paint there, and you'll have to start over again. Still working the values and colors down in the bottom half of the painting. One of the struggles that students have with watercolors, they look so different often when they are wet versus when they're dry. They certainly lose intensity, and they often lose value. They lighten up considerably, and this creates no end of frustration. And we all deal with it. I still deal with it now, and one of the things I'm doing in this painting is readjusting tones all the time. And as long as that sheet is damp or wet, I can keep readjusting those tones. We use different viscosities of paint, from tea and coffee to milk, cream, and finally what you might describe as sort of like pudding, depending on how wet the sheet is. So I'm constantly aware of the viscosity of the paint and the amount of water that's in it. Occasionally you'll see me switching off in this video to a size 12 Richardson pointed round to do smaller things where that size 20 might be too big. But usually I paint a great deal of my paintings with one or two or even three of these size 20s, and I just keep them all with different colors that I'm using in my palette, so I don't have to stop and clean out a brush to use it. This is another mix I'm going to use for the midground hills, and I don't use blacks. Black is too deep of a value to use in a painting. It throws all your values off, but I will make dark tones from Winsor Violet, burnt umber, sometimes Prussian blue. Sometimes if I want to warm it up, I'll use more burnt umber and maybe even some sap green in there, depending on the type of dark that I need. And then these darks have a lot of wonderful color in them as they dry. Because I've moistened the top of this tree shape before I began painting into it, the paint is drawn up into that paper and creates a soft fuzzy edge, just the way trees are in nature. So it's really the art of suggestion that we're working with in watercolor rather than the art of delineation or drawing. We want to suggest a lot of things. And the watercolor is beautiful because of its propensity to bleed and run. It'll do a lot of work for you and make a lot of wonderful suggestive shapes quite on its own that would be difficult to draw and make look believable. And here you can see an example of just that, where I've dampened this area and I'm just dropping these cream thick blends of dark tones right out of my palette. It's really a series of grays more than anything else, leaning towards the violet and the brown violet, and they tend to spread out and create these wonderful tree shapes that I'd be hard pressed to draw in and make believable. I'm using some Holbein lavender, which is a semi-opaque, a sedimentary color, to create that mid-ground tree within that dark space. I'll use that on the road as well, right through the center of the road, so that'll tie those two colors together. Still adjusting values in the road. Building texture and interest and variety in the ground plane, and also darkening the value of it as we go. You can only lay about 3 value washes in before the paper's lost its brilliance and the watercolor is essentially dead. Here I'm using that size 12 Richardson pointed round to create the trunk and some of the grass and weed detail on the ground. There's that Holbein lavender, that a beautiful color. That picks up and suggests that the sky color is in the ground, as it often is when the ground is moist. In this case, the road was still very damp from the rain we'd had that day. Darkening the base of these little blue stem grasses have such wonderful red, russet, and brown colors in the wintertime. This is cadmium red and burnt sienna. Now I'm using a brush called a liner, which is a very fine, skinny brush that makes these wonderful skinny lines. It has very long bristles on it, so it holds lots of paint. But because it's so narrow, it does a wonderful job with distant tree trunks. It holds lots of paint, so I don't have to go back to the palette very often. But you have to be decisive. You can't linger with this brush either. It will also unload paint into a big blob on your sheet if you don't keep it moving. So it's best to, before you lay these trunks in, to visualize how you want them to look. And if you have some photo reference, all the better. But don't overdo it. It's just a suggestion process. So I'm working very quickly with this liner brush. I've switched over to the size 12 pointed round to suggest the copse of trees and the cedars and the other vegetation way on that distant hillside. Just little dots within this damp sheet. They spread out and soften so they look very natural. Trying to bring this painting to a close now so I don't ruin it with too much detail and too much fiddling. Adding a few strengthening washes to the hillside to give it a little more shape, and a few more details in the distance there of trees and cows on the hillside. I still haven't fixed the sky yet. That's going to come. Here I've dampened the top of that midground tree canopy, and I'm using that liner to draw the branches right up into it. And that'll create just the kind of effect we want, where the tops of the trees are a little fuzzy and a little darker in places because of all the tiny little branches that are up there. So as I draw these lines up in there, they soften and spread out and lighten up as well. And the main thing is not to overdo these trees, but to give a nice suggestion. And then the fence posts. And the fence posts should be put in with single strokes. As the fence post gets further away from us, of course they crowd together, they get closer spaced. But having these fence posts in there helps me to, with my linear perspective, and build a sense of both scale and distance, because everybody understands how far away these fence posts are once you get them in there. Don't spend much time on them though. It has to be just a very quick suggestion, because they are not the focal point of the painting. They're just there to, as auxiliary actors to help the main players. Using fingers is perfectly acceptable if it works. Now I've decided to fix the sky. I've taken my big soft flat wash brush and I've loaded it with water and snapped it out on the floor once, and then lightly caressed the sheet with it very quickly. I'm not dragging to disturb the paint underneath. And there you'll see I tilt it back uphill to keep that paint from flowing down too quickly. For that reason, I rarely tape the bottom edges of my watercolor sheets. This 300 pound is heavy enough and stiff enough that I can do that with it. Keeping my brush moving very quickly, dancing across the surface. Keeping in mind that that sheet is drying out while I'm working on it, so I have to keep moving quickly. And I'll use that flat here in a second to soften some of those shapes. There it goes. Paint back into the shape. Again, these are colorful grays. I didn't mix a special color, they're just right out of the palette. Whatever was lying in there, leftover violets and blues. Softening with a little more water. If you do this correctly, you won't disturb the paint underneath. But you can't put too much pressure on that brush. It's just a very light dance across the surface. Sometimes you can test an area to see if it's still damp. Just lightly touch a little bit of color into it, and that'll tell you whether you can paint on it or not. There comes a point with a damp sheet when you can't paint on it anymore. It's a little bit too damp to paint and a little not dry enough. And there's the finish.